Today's message is called Jesus Brings Healing. It's the fourth sermon in the series from the Gospel of Mark that is preparing us for Easter, which is coming up very soon. We're going back to chapter 1, today starting in verse 29. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon Peter and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they immediately told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her by the hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. The scene here is the city of Capernaum, which had probably 1,500 people living there in that day. It was on the shore of Galilee, a fishing village. It was the headquarters of Jesus' Galilean ministry. Today, in that old city, in the ruins of that city, there is a modern church, and it has a glass floor, and you can look through the floor of the church and see the ruins of what is believed to be this very house where this healing took place. It's called St. Peter's Church, and it was a place that has been visited by perhaps millions of people over the years. A very special place to remember this event and also the ministry of Jesus in that region. Not far away from there is a 4th century synagogue, and some scholars believe that this was built directly over the synagogue that would have been there at the time of Jesus' presence in that place. Peter, we see, was married. This is the home of his mother-in-law, and the fever had gotten her, and fever was considered its own category of sickness, not just a symptom of another kind of sickness, but to have a fever was considered a sickness in itself. And Jesus makes the fever go away. Now, we all know that when you've had a fever, when the fever breaks, you still feel kind of weak and fatigued. But here we see in this scene that as soon as Jesus raised her up, she began to wait on them, to serve them. Well, that was probably her natural inclination to serve them, maybe prepare some food and give it to them. Maybe there were some people saying, "You don't need to do that, just sit down and rest." And maybe some even offered to help, but that was her natural inclination. And that was the way to show that she was really well, that she felt good, and she could serve them. This healing took place on the Sabbath. As the previous passage we talked about last week did, where in that case there was an evil spirit that was cast out on the Sabbath, and it was in the synagogue. And this event was immediately after that. And then we read that after sunset, the whole town gathers at the door. And they most likely did this because the Jewish Sabbath ends at sunset, so they could still observe the Jewish law, but then seek the healing that Jesus was doing. Well, then there's a shift. After these events, there's a shift in what Jesus plans to do. He goes out into a very solitary place, and in Mark 1, starting in verse 35, it says, "Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place, where he prayed. Simon Peter and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, 'Everyone is looking for you.' Jesus replied, 'Let us go somewhere else, to the nearby villages, so I can preach there also. That's why I have come.' So he traveled throughout Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons." So why did Jesus go away to pray? Well, the fact that they came after him, the disciples came and said, "Everyone's looking for you," gives us a clue. Jesus and his disciples could have set up shop, so to speak, there in Capernaum. They could have opened a clinic, a hospital of sorts, but not one that requires a surgeon's scalpel, but a place of divine healing, of prayer, of casting out demons and healing sickness. But Jesus says there's more to be done. Let's go somewhere else so he could preach. That's why I have come. Preaching the good news of the kingdom. Yes, it was greatly enhanced by these miraculous healings, but that wasn't all there was to the gospel. That wasn't the full gospel. Getting right with God was what was important. Forgiveness and hope. The healing was a part of that. But he was talking about their spiritual life for this life and the life to come. And he wanted to spread this good news around, so he wanted to go to different places. And yet here in Mark chapter 1, the very next thing we read about is another healing, and that is where Jesus heals a man with leprosy. Mark 1 verse 40. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus was indignant, or some manuscripts say that Jesus was filled with compassion. He reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came from everywhere to see him. This incident shows us that even after a healing, or perhaps some other powerful spiritual experience, that people don't always do what Jesus wants them to do. Going to a priest was intended to be a testimony to the priest and to the other Jewish leaders. Now, whether or not he went to the priest, we're not sure about that, but we do know that he immediately went out and told people everywhere about what had happened to him. That would be kind of the natural thing to do, but Jesus asked him not to do that. How many times have people, perhaps us, received some sort of spiritual blessing, maybe a healing or a special touch of God, an answer to prayer? We might have even been bargaining with God to say, I'll do this if you just bring about the thing I want. But sometime after it occurs, we might forget it or tuck it back in our memory bank. We might pass it off as if, oh, that would have happened anyway. That sickness would have gone away, or that event would have resolved itself. Maybe we only give credit to doctors or other people that have been involved. And somehow our passion for sharing that Jesus is the source of that wonderful event in our life, the passion kind of wears off. It shouldn't be that way. God gives us special experiences as a testimony that we can recall. When times are tough, we can remember that someone, Jesus, has been walking with us all the way. Healing continues to be a theme throughout the Gospel of Mark. And because there's so many incidences of Jesus healing, I'd like to just summarize a few of them. One of them we've already talked about in chapter 2 a couple weeks ago, where we were talking about Jesus announcing the gospel of good news of forgiveness of sins. In that one, a man that needed physical healing was lowered down through the roof of a home by his friends and family. And Jesus heals the man and also forgives his sins, which the religious leaders didn't like because they said only God can forgive sins. Jesus showed that was an indication that he truly was God in the flesh, and he had the authority to forgive sins. In chapter 3 of Mark, Jesus heals again, this time on the Sabbath. He heals a man with a shriveled hand, and it's in the synagogue. He knew people were watching, and he asked the man to stand up in front of everyone. This was another testimony healing because there were religious leaders, Pharisees, that saw this take place. And the Pharisees, rather than giving glory to God, they immediately sought out those that were called the Herodians to plot and plan a way to kill Jesus. In chapter 5, we read a wonderful story about Jesus raising a dead little girl, a very sad thing to think about. And at the same time, simultaneously, is involved in healing a sick woman. The scene here is that Jairus, who was a synagogue leader, pleaded with Jesus to come and heal his daughter. And as Jesus is starting on his way to heal this little girl, a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years snuck up through the crowd and touched the cloak of Jesus. She was immediately healed. And then Jesus noticed power had gone out from him. And he begins to ask the disciples, who touched me? And they said, well, there's a crowd. The people are brushing up against you and touching you. But Jesus kept looking around. And then the woman realizes that she was found out. And so she knew what had happened to her, and she went to Jesus, and she got down on her knees, fell at his feet, and trembling in fear told him the story. Jesus was not upset at all. In fact, he says to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Oh, how much that must have meant to her to be called daughter and to say, "Go in peace. You didn't do anything wrong. I'm glad to heal you." Now, right at that time, a message comes back that this sick little girl had actually died. People said it was too late. Jesus overheard what they were saying, and he said, "Don't be afraid, just believe." So he went to the home, and people were already wailing and crying over her death. And Jesus said he was there to heal her. And they laughed at him. They didn't think that could be possible. But that's exactly what he did. He commanded her to get up, and this young 12-year-old girl was healed and got up immediately. Chapter 7 of Mark gives us a scenario where Jesus heals a deaf and mute man. In the region of the Decapolis, which is a name for 10 cities, some people brought to Jesus this man who was deaf and he could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to lay his hands on him. It says in the scripture, verse 33 of chapter 7, after he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven with a deep sigh, said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. In chapter 8, Jesus heals a blind man. At Bethsaida, Jesus took the man by the hand and led him outside of that village. Interestingly, he spits on the man's eyes. He puts his hands on him. And then he asks the man, "Do you see anything?" And the man looks up and says, "I see people walking around, but they look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. This indicated that the man was probably able to see at some point in his life. Otherwise, how would he have known what the difference of a tree and people would look like? But it was just kind of foggy to him. It wasn't super clear. People looked like trees. And then with another act of special touch and Jesus putting his hands on the man's eyes, he saw everything clearly. And then our final story today is from chapter 10, where we read about blind Bartimaeus, who receives his sight. It says in chapter 10, verse 46, then they came to Jericho. And so this shows that Jesus was traveling to a lot of different places. Jericho is down in one of the lowest places on earth, way down from Jerusalem. He goes to Jericho, and Jesus and his disciples are there. And together there's a large crowd. They're leaving the city. A blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus. The bar means son of Timaeus. And he was sitting by the roadside begging. That's the way he had to make his living. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and called him. So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet, he's calling for you." Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked him. The blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus, "your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. I just love this passage. It reminds us that it is okay to tell Jesus what we want him to do for us. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" I remember being a part of a ministry of prayer called the Journey to Wholeness in Christ. And the prayer counselors would gather around the room, and if people needed prayer, they would come up and ask for prayer. But rather than just saying, "Tell me your need and I'll pray for you," we would ask, "Will you pray? Will you ask Jesus?" You be the one to ask Jesus what you want him to do for you. And Jesus asked this man, "What do you want me to do for you?" And I think in many ways, Jesus asks us that same question today. What about you? Do you have something that you want from Jesus? Jesus wants to know. What do you want him to do? Now, we may not always see the answer exactly like we want it to be, but Jesus cares what our wants are. In fact, Jesus tells us in the Gospels to ask according to his will, whatever we want, and Jesus will respond to us. He cares about our wants, our needs. So in these passages, I know we went through a lot of them today, we see that Jesus uses different methods for healing. He sometimes uses touch, sometimes he heals from a distance. He even used spit, or the old-fashioned word is spittle. He put his hands on people. Sometimes the healing was instant, and sometimes it was gradual. There were times he said, "Don't tell anybody," and other times where he did it in an obvious place where the crowd could see. Jesus used different methods. Jesus also made people feel valued. He took their hand, he looked at them, he loved them, he cared for them. He values people. Still today, he does very much value people, and he wants us to feel valued by him. And we see that Jesus teaches through healing. He teaches us about spiritual sight, not just physical sight, about a testimony to God's power. If God can touch our lives in a special way in the moment, won't God continue to touch our lives in special ways in the future? He treats people with value and respect and shows us how we are too to treat people with that same kind of value and respect and with integrity and tenderness and treating each person with dignity. Now, some people might ask, well, why does Jesus let people get sick in the first place? Why do people have physical challenges or become injured or die? Well, we live in a fallen world. We know that many bad things happen. We know that eventually our bodies wear out. We are destined to die at some point. But in the midst of that, Jesus shows that he's real, that he's with us, that he cares for us, and that we are to be ready for whatever he wants to do for us and with us. In this time of the coronavirus pandemic, there have been so many things to pray about. Not only the COVID sickness, but job loss and social unrest, fires, ice storms, the list goes on and on. The prayer lists have been long. Our church prayer list has been long because we've had lots of people facing hardship or having loved ones or friends that have. Among our own family, my own family, we've had friends and family that have suffered from COVID, who have had cancer surgery, who have had heart surgeries, and the list goes on and on. You can all think of people, I'm sure, that have needed prayer and God's special touch during this time. So let's think back in our own lives to take time to think about how God has carried us through. And then to think of those who right now, whether it's ourselves or others, that need a special touch from God, need some comfort, some compassion, some healing. And how might God use us to minister to those people that are in need? Healing is not just physical. It's mental, it's emotional, it's spiritual. It happens in different ways. My final question is, what do you want Jesus to do for you today? What do you want Jesus to do for you? Pray with faith and let him reveal to you his working in your life in whatever way that comes about. God bless you.